Alright guys, so this is my last talk. It's titled Lightning Network Powered Games. And so in the last couple months, I've been thinking and researching about this idea of incorporating Lightning into games. And as a preface, I'm not actually a game developer, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt. This presentation is an attempt to condense some of those thoughts and ideas about how games might be an interesting application for Lightning, and hopefully you'll be inspired to build one yourself. So, question, who here has played a game? Alright, so that's a pretty dumb question. We've all played some kind of game. The gaming industry is massive. There's an enormous variety of games for us to play. They're on our phones, computers, consoles, and even that little screen in front of you when you're on your plane. And yeah, they're everywhere. Some games are free, others you have to pay for. Some games make you gamble, others help you pass your time in your commute. So my talk centers around Lightning as a payment method in games. Towards the end of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about some other potential uses of cryptocurrency for games. So, how do games use money? Number one is pay to play. This is the most direct way that games might use money. So, you can think of an arcade machine as an example. You're merely paying to use the machine for a given amount of time or to perform a specific action. And Satoshi's Place is in this category. You're simply paying to draw on the canvas, and that's it. Number two is in-game purchases. So games can allow you to make in-app purchases to buy items or power-ups or whatever. And this is actually the main way that free games nowadays monetize themselves. In-app currencies is another way. So most of the time, games create their own virtual currency, which is then used to purchase actual in-game items. Game designers leverage this fact that human psychology works in funny ways when it comes to money. So for example, by giving us a virtual currency such as gems instead of US dollars, users are abstracted away from the real value of money and are more likely to spend. And this is also maybe a technical reason, because microtransactions aren't really feasible in our traditional payment networks. So even if the game designer wanted to sell you an item worth 5 cents, he might not be able to do that. So a workaround is to make you deposit $5, which is then converted into a game balance, and then you can finally make those microtransactions. And most games in this category let you deposit money, but not necessarily withdraw. Number four is trading. So some games allow players to trade in-game items between each other, and in some cases, in-game items are monetized by players and used to gamble on professional matches. This was the case with Counter-Strike. And whilst regulation regarding money in games varies from country to country, today some marketplaces exist which allow players to trade games for real money, sometimes even Bitcoin. Number five is probably the most obvious one, which is gambling. It's maybe the most prevailing form that games use money. Usually games of chance, mostly against house odds, but sometimes between players, like in the case of online poker. Online casinos and sports betting are probably the most common types of games where the flow of money can actually be bidirectional, meaning that you can put money into the game, but then eventually you might be able to take money out of the game if you're lucky enough to be a winner. And this industry obviously is very heavily regulated, and Bitcoin even has a long history in this regard since the days of Satoshi's dice. So, is that repeated? Yeah, so number six is Twitch/spectator donations. This is kind of like an indirect way. Yeah, like Twitch streamers get donations whilst they're playing games from people who are spectating. maybe Lightning can play a role there. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So yeah, so how can Lightning affect each one of these categories? So for the first one, pay to play, maybe game developers are able to charge less for their games. Maybe your indie game is only worth 10 cents. And with Lightning, you can easily charge small amounts for your game. So yeah, you can do that. Number two, for in-game purchases, it's also a similar way that you can benefit from the fact that you can have lower value in-game items, which can be monetized. For number three, in-app currencies, this is a little bit more interesting because the complexity of implementing user balances and deposits is not strictly necessary, but game designers might still want to do that because there's the psychological effect. Number four, trading. I think here Lightning actually gives you a powerful method for regulatory arbitrage. It allows users to engage in permissionless bidirectional commerce, and the marketplace can simply consist of an escrow which can intermediate the rapid exchange of money and game assets, but like minimizing the amount of time the funds are held in custody. Yeah, don't confuse this with the idea of putting assets on a blockchain yet. That's going to come later. And for gambling, again, regulatory arbitrage. There's a good example of an online chance game that uses Lightning Network right now, developed by Rui Gomes, called Lightning Spin. And in this game, you can put some satoshis to spin a wheel. The outcome is provably fair, and then if you're lucky, you can withdraw your winnings. And this is a good example of that bidirectional function of Lightning, with trust minimization, since the game only holds the funds for a minimal amount of time. And then finally, for the Twitch donation, an extension of this idea is that Lightning can maybe provide a fun way for spectators to interact with the players of a game. You can imagine showing a QR code in the game, and then you could have a situation where you can support your favorite player or interfere in the game somehow. And the advantage here maybe is that integrating Lightning payments is very easy because you just need to render that QR code, and then you have instant settlements for microtransactions. So how did developers and players benefit from this? I personally think it boils down to the three characteristics enabled by Bitcoin and the Lightning Network. Permissionless. So gaming tends to attract a younger audience. So developers and players without access to banking might struggle to monetize their access to their games. Monetize or access games. And most payment processors require you to be 18 years old. And permissionless also means that games with that bidirectional flow might be possible. And yeah, it opens up the possibility that you can consider games where players can compete with each other. The second feature I think is important is low fees. Existing payment processors today can charge anything between 6 to 30%, and players and developers can incur significant fees for their games. And then finally, microtransactions, this ability to transact in small values is significant because it unlocks the ability to monetize things which might be too low in value to be feasible nowadays. But I don't think this is a panacea. There's a good argument to be made that if you keep lowering the cost of something, at some point there's a threshold where the mental cost of accounting for these tiny amounts becomes unfeasible for the human brain to process. Sorry, can we leave the questions towards the end? And also studies have shown that people perceive 115-cent payments more painful than a single $15 payment, even though the amount is the same. and also this is why services like your internet contract and Netflix charge you a monthly fixed rate for unlimited usage, because you can imagine if you had to account for every single second that you pay for Netflix, then yeah, that might be a pain. So why are games an interesting application for Lightning? Because they're fun. What better way to encourage adoption than by giving people something fun to do with their Bitcoin? Number two is an audience that gets it. So since games are mostly targeted at a younger audience, I think younger people are generally quicker to adopt new technologies, and so they might be quicker to adopt Lightning. Number three is that gaming has usually been at the forefront of a lot of development in computer science, in the field of 3D modeling, simulations, artificial intelligence. Game engines usually push the boundaries of what's possible with 3D graphics, and we're seeing that today with VR. So exploring new possibilities of Lightning in gaming might be an interesting breeding ground for innovation. Number four is digital. So most modern day games are natively digital, and since Bitcoin and Lightning are also natively digital, this is a perfect combination. And finally, gaming is a huge industry. There's an estimated $125 billion market, and with the rise of esports, the industry is projected to grow another 14% by the year of 2020. So now that we've talked a little bit about how we might use Lightning in games, or why we might use it, as well as some of the important characteristics, I'll try and narrow things down on some specifics of the type of Lightning game that I think would be interesting to build. So number one is indie. Independent indie games are games which are made with a very low or non-existent budget, sometimes by a single developer or a small studio. Big game publishers who make AAA titles sometimes run budgets in the tens of millions of dollars for their games. They also have complex production and distribution chains, so the benefits of Lightning for that particular purpose, it seems that it's more obvious for small indie developers. Number two is browser-based. So who here remembers Flash games? Ever since Steve Jobs sounded the death knell to Flash by cutting support for it on iOS, I think the door has been open for HTML5 browser standards to take over. And one of the recent remarkable examples of this is the rise of what's known as the IO games. It's a type of online multiplayer game characterized by simple mechanics, simple graphics, a very addicting gameplay. And so for Lightning-based games, I think browsers are a tempting platform to build your game on. Number three is multiplayer. I think the idea of multiplayer games where players can cooperate or compete against each other opens up possibilities to use money in innovative ways. So instead of competing with your friends for money in a game of poker, why not bash it out in a game of Bomberman where the last man standing takes the pot? And finally, number four, online. So you have to be online because of your Lightning nodes. Okay, so I'll pick up a little bit on the anatomy of a multiplayer game. So in the real world, when we're playing a board game with friends or family, we generally trust that nobody's going to cheat. So we tend to assign a referee to rule over the game. And even in situations with money, there's a certain degree of trust. You might remember trusting your brother to be the banker in a game of Monopoly. Of course, he wouldn't ever cheat, right? And a game of poker between friends is another example where you play a game with money wagered in bets, and the dealer is just one of your friends that's playing the game. So it's the other way around. But yeah, for those of you who grew up with LAN parties, you might remember that usually one person was assigned as the host of the game and that everybody else would connect to him. And so in this situation, it's fine that the host is also a player. You trust that your friend isn't running a modified version of Call of Duty, and he'll like sneakily give that'll sneakily give him an advantage over everybody else. So that's sort of like a diagram representing this sort of LAN party game, or like peer-to-peer games. And in adversarial conditions, however, we need an impartial referee who can prevent players from cheating, and that referee will ultimately dictate the winner. And so in multiplayer games, the same structure exists, and we call this referee the authoritative multiplayer server. And authoritative servers run simulations of your game, usually on a headless server, and they're the de facto source of truth to which all clients sync their state to. The server isn't a player in the game, they're just the referee. Now, going from a single player game to a multiplayer game usually increases the complexity by an order of magnitude. You suddenly need to worry about things such as latency compensation, game matching, state synchronization, and other things. And other types of games are going to be harder to implement than others. So, for example, a 2D game in this context is going to be easier than a 3D game, or like a turn-based game is going to be easier than a real-time game. Okay, so let's look at some of the existing Lightning games that we have today. So the first one on the top left there is Lightning Spin, which I previously mentioned, a chance game where you spin the wheel and then you can take your winnings. Poketoshi is a Pokemon streaming game where the user can pay for each button press. On the top right is Satoshi's Games. This is a collection of Bitcoin and Lightning themed games meant to promote Lightning usage. And the interesting thing about what the developers are doing there is they're trying to create a sort of like Steam-like service to aggregate multiple Lightning-based games. Yeah. And the fourth one, Satoshi's Place, well, that one's obvious. Saratobi, in the middle of the bottom row, is a little platform game where you pay to access the game, developed by a developer with the handle Mandelduck. He also has another one called Saratobi Island, where there's like digital assets using Counterparty, and then there's some like experimental stuff with Lightning. And then the final one here on the bottom right is Lightning0ala, which is another casino-style chance game. There's also some really cool experimental stuff being worked on. Konstantin is actually going to be at the hackathon this weekend, and earlier this summer he showed me this demo here, which was this tank battle game built with the Unity demo, and he handed me a Nintendo Switch controller, and we started like duking it out. And then at some point, he renders a QR code, scans and pays for it, and then that gives me like a shield on my tank. And that was just showing that Twitch idea that I was talking about earlier. And over there on the left, he's got Lightning payments integrated into a Minecraft game, where I think you can do teleports and other stuff like that. Right. So if you're thinking about making a game, these are some of the tools that I think might be useful to look at. So in terms of game engines, you've got Phaser, Unity, and Play Canvas, which are good choices if you wanna do something for the browser. For the authoritative game server, there's a couple of third-party and open source options. Nakama, Calicius, and PlayFab are some of the examples. And finally, if you integrate Lightning directly with gRPC in LND, or using the REST interfaces, there's like some plugins. Well, you can either do it directly, or there's some plugins that you can use for Unity, or you can just go to something standard if you're just making something from scratch. Right, so now This is the controversial part of the talk. So within this concept of cryptocurrencies and gaming, there's also the idea of turning in-game items into blockchain-based digital collectibles in an attempt to make those items immutable, transparent, scarce, and tradable without intermediaries. And most of the attempts being made are on-chain, but the scalability properties of these approaches are not very good. And the idea has been around for a while in the cryptocurrency space. Perhaps one of the most popular implementations is with Counterparty, and over there there's some examples of games which were built, like Spells of Genesis, Saratobi Island, and some other stuff. Rare Pepes is another big one. And during the past year, we've been seeing a lot of attention in these type of games in the Ethereum ecosystem, with CryptoKitties probably being the most famous example of this. And now there's a lot of different projects trying to implement this concept in sort of like trading card game, with trading card game mechanics, similar to like Hearthstone or Magic the Gathering. But as we've seen in this talk, we're still going to have that trust intermediary. We're still going to have to trust an intermediary referee when using assets in the game. And maybe perhaps at best we can minimize the amount of time players will surrender custody of their assets or tokens to that referee, but you're still going to need it. I haven't really seen anything realistically scale this application. And also, like, making claims about digital scarcity on blockchains which make bad trade-offs between scalability and decentralization leaves the open question of whether or not ownership of these assets can be guaranteed into the future. So to me, it's a little bit pulling the cart before the horse. I think it's hard enough to get one token working, Bitcoin, but trying to do all these different tokens on it might seem a bit too early. I'm not saying it's not possible and the use cases aren't interesting, but essentially my approach is to look at this from a payments perspective. Yeah, some research is being done on Lightning. There's the RGB protocol that's looking into this on Lightning. Maybe it doesn't work on Lightning, maybe it needs to be done on a sidechain. I don't know. Right, and so I want to end this on a little bit of a cosmic tone. So in 1969, ARPANET network was born, and this was later going to become the internet. And this is the network map showing the growth over a span of 8 years. And yeah, so what you're seeing here is the birth of the internet. And fast forward to January 2018, and we have the Lightning Network being born. And there's about 13 nodes in that graph, 14 channels, and negligible capacity on the network. Fast forward again to a couple of weeks ago, and now we have 3,776 nodes, 9,322 channels, and 111 BTC in capacity. And this is just from the visible network. Nodes who remain private are not included. So I think when we're faced with revolutionary technology, it's really hard to predict what uses are going to come of it. And we've seen this with so many things, like the car, electricity, TV, the internet. So in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and this idea of the internet began to enter the public consciousness. And in just the 28 years since then, we've seen an explosion of innovation fueled by the internet. And we all know who these guys are. There's like a ton of other examples. This is just like a sliver of what we have. And we have this gigantic industry that's sprung up, and it's just become so common in our daily lives. And nowadays, it's hard to imagine a world without them, and especially for younger generations that are growing up with this technology. So if you ask somebody back in the 90s, in 28 years, what do you think are going to be the applications that people will use on the internet? Do you think you would have been able to guess what the outcome was? And more importantly, would you have been able to build it? And so I think this is where we are with the Lightning Network. January 14, 2016 was when the white paper was released. And it's been less than a year since the release of the first viable Lightning implementations. and yet we've already seen explosive growth in the development of infrastructure and applications. So my question to you is, let's say in 10 years, what do you think are going to be the Lightning applications that are going to become common in our daily lives? And hopefully Lightning Games is one of those. Thank you very much. Questions?
I was wondering if, do you know, Apple have a stance on allowing apps to be released in the App Store that use Lightning for micropayments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, will Apple have a stance on releasing Lightning Network applications on their App Store? So part of the reason I suggested to focus on browser-based games is because of the ability to publish your game a bit easier than on the App Store. I think the App Store is probably the hardest, one of the hardest ones. I don't speak from personal experience on games specifically, but I have worked on like wallets, trying to deploy wallets to the App Store. So as soon as you have anything related to finance, it becomes pretty hard to get approved. And I think it's probably against their incentive, because I think when you implement when you deploy a game on the App Store, you have to use their payment processor to monetize your games. And then the other thing worth mentioning is, so with the rise of like web standards, we have progressive web apps today, which one of the things is the idea of using the service worker to allow you to, when you're browsing an application, you can add it to your home screen on Android. And that's sort of a really good way to get users to install your application. And then that app will work like a normal application. It'll work offline and stuff. But again, for Apple, again, I don't know if this is the case, but I believe that they're probably holding back on this because it's against their incentive, because their store drives so much traffic. So yeah. All right, thanks guys.